In the beginning, there was nothing. Only jazz.
In a country deemed the melting pot of the world, jazz emerged as a cultural unique to America. It came as a blend of both European and African influences that would not only give birth to a new style of music, but would create cultural movements that would expand civil liberties for both African Americans and women. From the moment the first slave landed in the Americas, the development of jazz began to take roots. And as a cultural form of self-expression, jazz has evolved and transformed its style, variety, and even flavor. Along with its uniqueness, jazz has been and has continued to captivate the listeners of millions throughout the world.
Jazz music has its humble beginnings on the plantations. For the African-American slaves, music was a refuge from the harsh realities of daily life. Despite many of them coming from different parts of Africa, the slaves naturally congregated into tight-knit communities. The enslaved individuals would sing songs and dance, applying their African music culture and new techniques to their music. The slaves began to assimilate to the Western ideology, especially religion. The African slaves developed a strong passion in Christ and sympathized with the stories from the Bible. Even though many slaves lacked the resources, such as the Bible and hymn scores, the slaves would passionately improvise the traditional hymns and songs that they heard and recalled.
European and African culture would first collide and produce a completely new art form. The combination of African rhythms and improvisation, along with European melodic conception and harmonic sonorities from biblical hymns, would produce a complete, distinct new style of music, spiritual music.
This music was most commonly sung through call and response format. A leader improvises a line of text, and a chorus of singers provides a solid refrain in unison. Through oral tradition, they would pass down their songs from each generation to the next, always changing and evolving. Here we can see the clear beginning of jazz music through the call and response, improvisation, and passion expressed through the enslaved individuals.
The thing to remember about the very early days of jazz is what we think of as sort of New Orleans, Dixieland jazz or whatever around the time of World War I. It came from New Orleans, right? And New Orleans is one of the biggest melting pots that anyone in the world's ever seen, right?
New Orleans
was and continues to be a land with a unique and diverse culture. Since colonial times, the land that is now known as New Orleans has differed greatly from the rest of the country. Unlike the rest of America, New Orleans was made up of Catholic and French speakers rather than Protestant and English speakers. By the 1720s, Africans made up 30% of the population. The territory was then ceded to the Spanish in 1763, and finally, in 1803, America purchased the Louisiana Territory. As a result, New Orleans became an area of extreme cultural and ethnic diversity. With both European and African representation, New Orleans was set up to be the birthplace of jazz.
The blend of different ethnic groups led to a unique and distinct culture that centered around dance and music. This appreciation for the arts helped preserve the African roots of music. Areas such as the Congo Square were places where slaves were allowed to congregate despite some threats to these gatherings. As slaves continued to sing, dance, and perform in the Congo Square, the influences of their music continued to spread and change the dynamics of music in New Orleans. Differing from the rest of America, New Orleans was truly a melting pot of different races, cultures, and music.
In the unique culture of New Orleans, jazz music was also impacted by the popular musical forms that spread throughout the country. The emergence of big brass bands, along with a growing natural interest in African American traditions, such as cakewalks or minstrel tunes, the strong national interest in these musical forms led many formerly trained musicians to perform in these big brass bands. As the roots of jazz began taking form, so did the culture of mutual aid as people from multiple ethnic groups worked and helped one another. By the turn of the 19th century, New Orleans had become a cultural hub of entertainment, and while still in the early stages of development, jazz music and culture slowly began to spread across the country.
In 1917, the Dixieland Jazz Band recorded the first commercial jazz recording. The release was an unexpected hit that would make New Orleans jazz a national craze. As musicians migrated to major northern cities such as Chicago and New York, jazz began to grow in popularity and became more defined. And also, different areas began developing different styles, and by the 1920s, jazz turned from a simple art form into a cultural movement across the country. America had finally entered the Jazz Age.
The 1920s signified a large social shift for women across the country. Not only had they just gained the right to vote, but the Jazz Age quickly challenged the traditional role of women. One of these changes were the flappers, young women who embraced new fashions, personal freedoms, and ideas. Despite flappers being generally portrayed as airheaded, ditzy girls, many were well-educated and intelligent. These girls were trying to change society by building their own path and improving their future. Also, this time period saw an unprecedented increase in women in the workplace and in college. Even though they were made fun of and looked down upon, they continued, and women today should thank the women of the 1920s for their rights, many of which were unthinkable in the Jazz Age.
There were very prominent African American jazz performers who made a lot of noise during the heyday during the flowering of the movement in the 50s and 60s, right? Did it help that a lot of performers that people were really loved in the 50s and 60s were African American performers? Of course it did, But I don't know. That's a tough question. Paved the way? I don't know about paved the way. Grease the wheels? Yeah.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, here's one you all can sing with us.
As well as the newfound popularity of jazz, the Harlem Renaissance brought even more popularity to the genre. The Harlem Renaissance saw an increase in jazz musicians hailing from poorer areas, such as singer Billie Holiday, and trumpeter Louis Armstrong, who originally came from New Orleans, but he was a figurehead in this movement. But beyond jazz, the Harlem Renaissance was a cultural movement that helped expand liberties for African Americans as a whole. This time period featured black leaders like James Weldon Johnson, Charles S. Johnson, and Elaine Locke, who believed that in order for blacks to achieve greatness, they had to produce great art. Many important black political leaders also came about during the Renaissance, such as Marcus Garvey and his Universal Negro Improvement Association, A. Philip Randolph, the head of the Pullman Porters Union, and W.E.B. Du Bois, the founder of the NAACP, continued to push for civil rights.
Like God, Jupiter and Mars. In other words, hold my hand. In other words, baby, kiss me. Fill my heart with song.
Even after the end of the Jazz Age and World War II, jazz continued to have strong influences in American society, especially throughout the Civil Rights era. As jazz continued to be a widely popular music, it helped open the conversation about racism and segregation. Popular musicians such as John Coltrane were also important figureheads in expanding the conversation. John Coltrane was deeply involved in the Civil Rights Movement and shared many of Malcolm X's views on black consciousness and Pan-Africanism, which he had incorporated into his music.
Now it's this beautiful American jewel, this cultural jewel of the United States. It's this thing like baseball that we've given the world, that the people all over the world think it's really cool. It's this kind of cultural thing that's now been held up. It's not popular music anymore. And, where has it wound up? This is a good question, but where has it wound up? It's wound up in schools. It's wound up in good schools like this one. It's wound up in colleges that have good jazz programs and stuff. And it has some traction, but it's not the cultural thing that it was back in the day.
Jazz no longer carries the popularity or cultural significance it once had. What was once unanimously agreed as the most popular music has dwindled to an art form of the past. Yet despite the fall of jazz, the music continues to live on in the form of American students. Students that willingly give up their time to learn and perform a music beyond their time. While not all students need to play or perform jazz, it is important that as a society we appreciate an art form unique to America and realize the impacts of the music.